Hi everyone, welcome to the visual guide for Eden's Gate Descent Savage. This is the second new Savage difficulty encounter made available by patch 5.05 in Final Fantasy XIV Shadowbringers. My name is Ms. Tech and I'll be your raid guide. We begin with Doomvoid a conal attack that targets every single player for moderate damage and a short physical vulnerability up debuff. To handle this, each player will be assigned a specific spot around the boss to avoid overlap. Each of these attacks will then spawn a Nyx ad that will make its way in towards the boss. Standing in the way of these ads will deal damage to you and debuff you with damage down and a curse that increases damage taken. As such, after Doomvoid Cleaver hits and the ads spawn, each player must take care to dodge the incoming ads as necessary. Next up, Unholy Darkness will target a random player for the stack up marker. The raid will need to group up to share the incoming damage. This is immediately followed by one of two possible attacks, Doomvoid Slicer or Doomvoid Guillotine. Slicer is a room-wide donut attack and all players need to move into the hitbox to avoid it. Guillotine is a massive line attack through the front and back of the boss. Players will need to move to the boss's sides to avoid. Each of these attacks will spawn another set of Nyx ads in the pattern of that initial attack. Slicer spawns Nyx in a ring around the boss that will move in. Guillotine will spawn ads along the line of the attack that will move towards the outer edges of the platform. Regardless of the Nyx pattern, all players need to ensure they move out of the way of the ads to avoid damage and debuffs. All three Doomvoid attacks and their resultant Nyx patterns will happen throughout the encounter, and I recommend getting used to the movement for each as quickly as possible. Next up, 4 players will be targeted for Darkfire 3 circle AoEs. These players will need to spread apart to avoid overlapping. Eventually, the boss will spawn 8 puddles in a set location around the platform and call down discs. These discs must be soaked by standing in each puddle or they will explode, deal high damage, and debuff everyone. Similar to normal mode, standing in these puddles will apply a mild bleed debuff on players, so healers beware. To ensure each puddle is soaked, assign 1 player to each puddle. At this point, the boss will begin to cast Spell in Waiting, which will delay the next incoming attack. The first delayed attack is an Unholy Darkness stack up. The damage for this attack will be the last to go off in this combo, so for now, it can be ignored. The second delayed attack is another 4 Darkfire 3s. These attacks will go off first, and affected players can spread immediately to avoid overlapping. The third delay attack in this combo is Shadow Eye, which will target 1 player with a gaze attack that all other players must turn away from to avoid getting petrified. Immediately after, the boss will also cast Hellwind, which will target 2 damage dealers with these prey markers. The health pools of these players will be brought down to 1 at the end of the cast. The Hellwind cast coincides with the damage application of Unholy Darkness and the gaze attack itself. To handle this combo, once the 4 Darkfire 3 attacks go off, all players can move in to stack with the Unholy Darkness player, except for the Shadow Eye player, who will move slightly behind the group. Once the 2 Hellwind players are identified, they will move out of the pack to avoid the damage they will not be able to survive once their HP is reduced. All of this is done while facing away from the Shadow-Eyed player in the back. All of the attacks will then resolve, and the healers can heal everyone back up to full. Next up, Shadow Flame will target both tanks for a tank buster. Cool down and heal through this as necessary. This is followed by Entropy, which will deal high raid-wide damage. Immediately after, the Hand of Erebos will spawn and begin to cast Empty Rage. If you see this, along with a red and orange tether from the boss to the hand, all players will need to move to the opposite side of the platform to avoid the massive incoming AoE blast. This is immediately followed by another Doomvoid Guillotine, and all players will need to move to the sides of the boss to avoid it. Dodge the incoming line of Nyx ads, and then immediately move into the boss's hitbox for the next Doomvoid Slicer. Another Hand of Erebos will manifest here and begin to cast Empty Hate, signified by this blue and black tether. This will knock back all players a set distance from the side, and you'll need to either move to that side or use a knockback immunity to avoid falling off the platform. Since you're still actively dodging the Slicer Nyx ads, I'd recommend using a knockback immunity to minimize the chaos of all of these mechanics at once and help you position properly for the next Doomvoid Cleaver attack. Stand in your assigned spot around the boss and then move out of the way of the next set of Nyx ads. Next, another Shadow Flame tank buster on both tanks into another Entropy AoE blast. Here, the next combo of Spell in Waiting attacks begin with 2 players targeted for a delayed Hellwind. 3 players will then be targeted with Flare markers. They'll need to immediately move away from the group to the corners of the platform to minimize damage. The next spell in waiting is a delayed Shadow Eye on one player. Immediately after, the 8 bleed puddles will spawn and the 2 Hellwind players will have their HPs reduced shortly after. Healers will need to quickly top these players off before they can stand in their puddles. As each player soaks their bleed puddle, they must also turn away from the player with Shadow Eye. The puddles and Shadow Eye will resolve at the same time. Next up, another double Shadow Flame Tank Buster and yet another Entropy Blast. Immediately after, each player will be targeted by either a black or a white circle. They'll need to pair up with a player of the opposite color or they'll explode and probably die. You can assign each tank and healer to a damage dealer to always ensure equilibrium. This is immediately followed by another Doom Void Cleaver, so as soon as the black and white circles resolve, all players must immediately move into their assigned spots to avoid overlapping. Dodge the next set of Nyx adds and then stack up with the player affected by Unholy Darkness to share the damage. Next will be either a Doom Void Slicer or a Doom Void Guillotine. Adjust for this attack as necessary and then dodge the next set of Nyx adds. Heal and cooldown through another Shadow Flame Tank Buster and Entropy AoE Blast. At this point, another spell in waiting combo will begin. 3 delayed flares will mark up 3 players and the Hand of Erebos will attempt another knockback. Using your knockback immunity here is recommended. This is followed by a delayed Unholy Darkness stack up. As soon as this applies, the first round of delayed flares can move into their corners. 3 more delayed flare markers will mark up another 3 players. These flares will not go off for some time and can be ignored for now. As soon as the first round of flare damage goes out, all players can stack with the Unholy Darkness player to share the damage. This is a fairly high damage section of the fight, so healers be ready. Tanks will deal with another Shadow Flame Tank Buster, and then 2 delayed Shadow Eyes will form on 2 players. The Shadow Eye and second round of flares will all resolve at the same time. To easily handle this, each flare marker can be moved to a corner, while the 2 Shadow Eye players can move into the free corner or hang out in that general area at max melee. All other players will need to be ready to face away from the Shadow Eye group to avoid the gaze attack. As these players are moving into position, 3 more players will be marked with a slightly delayed Darkfire 3. These Darkfires will need to be spread as soon as the flare markers go off to avoid overlapping damage. Immediately after, another round of black and white circles and another set of bleed puddles will spawn on the platform. Players will need to resolve the black and white circles first before moving into their assigned puddles to soak the damage. As soon as the bleed puddles resolve, players will need to move to their positions for Doom Void Cleaver. Don't forget to dodge the incoming set of Nyx adds. One last Shadow Flame on the 2 tanks and the boss will eventually enter his Soft Enrage phase. Quietus will deal raid-wide damage and give the boss a stacking damage up buff. Voidwalker will then cast either Cycle of Retribution or Cycle of Chaos, which will cause all 3 Doom Void attacks to quickly cast in succession. If it's Cycle of Chaos, players can expect Guillotine into Slicer into Cleaver, and they'll need to first move to the sides of the boss, dodge the Nyx adds while moving into the hitbox, and then repositioning in their assigned spots, and then dodging both incoming rounds of Nyx. If it's Cycle of Retribution, players can expect a Slicer into a Cleaver into a Guillotine, and they'll need to stand in the hitbox in their assigned spots, and then move out to the boss's sides, all while dodging the Nyx adds as they come in. One of these cycles will cast first, and then after all 3 attacks go off, the other cycle will cast next. As you can see, this is very hectic, and players should focus on dodging each attack and Nyx set to minimize damage and debuffs. The boss will cast another Quietus and gain another damage up buff. Another random cycle will cast here. Move for either Retribution or Chaos and dodge each set of Nyx adds. At this point, the boss will cast another 3 Quietus in a row, gaining damage up buffs each time. Eventually, Voidwalker will then cast a slower Quietus as a hard enrage and you will die. Practicing the movement and minimizing the number of debuffs you get will help you meet the DPS check before the enrage kills you. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. Up next, we'll head into Eden's Gate Inundation. As always, thanks for watching. Till next time.